began as just another night in Las Vegas. The neon lights burned through the desert air, the casinos hummed with energy, and inside the showroom of the International Hotel, the king of rock and roll was about to do what he did best. Fans filled every seat, women in sequined gowns and men in pressed suits leaning forward in anticipation. The orchestra tuned softly, the stage lights dimmed, and the room settled into that breathless silence that only Elvis Presley could command. He had done this 1,000 times before, walked out, smiled that crooked smile, and poured his soul into songs that had defined a generation. But this night would not be like the others. This night, one choice, one sentence spoken into the microphone would shift the energy of the entire room. Elvis stepped up, took a slow breath, and in a voice heavy with memory, he said, "This one's for Priscilla." 3 words, just 3, but they landed like thunder. The audience froze, a murmur rippled across the hall, and then, almost eerily, silence fell. The kind of silence you can feel pressing against your chest. Fans who had come for entertainment suddenly found themselves caught in a moment that felt private, raw, and unshakably real. Why did he say it? Why her after everything that had happened? By that time, Elvis and Priscilla had been apart for years. Their marriage collapsed under the weight of fame, distance, and heartbreak. Yet here he was, on stage, laying bare his heart in front of strangers. The crowd waited, suspended in disbelief. Elvis adjusted the microphone, lowered his eyes, and began to sing the song that once defined their love story, "Love Me Tender." But this wasn't just a performance. It was a confession, a plea, perhaps even a farewell. And as the first tender notes drifted across the room, the silence grew heavier, almost sacred. That single dedication, that fragile moment, became one of the most haunting displays of Elvis Presley's humanity. The world saw the king, but in that instant, they saw the man, wounded, longing, and still tethered to the woman who had once been his everything. This is the story behind that dedication, the love, the loss, the silence that stunned an audience, and why even today, people still whisper about the night Elvis Presley gave away his heart on stage. To understand why those words hit like lightning, you need to know the story behind them, not the tabloid headlines, not the glossy magazine photos, but the aching truth of a love story lived under impossible pressure. It all began in Germany. In 1959, Elvis Presley was not the dazzling Las Vegas icon yet. He was a young soldier, drafted into the U.S. Army, stationed thousands of miles from home. He had lost his mother just months before, and the grief still clung to him like a shadow. Behind the fame, the money, the screaming crowds, he was just a lonely young man trying to navigate a world that suddenly felt empty. And then one evening, at a gathering hosted for servicemen, a 14-year-old girl walked into the room. Her name was Priscilla. She was soft-spoken, with dark hair framing a face that carried both innocence and mystery. She was the daughter of a U.S. Air Force officer living on base in Germany. By all accounts, she was far too young for him, but when Elvis looked at her, something shifted. She wasn't just another pretty face. There was something magnetic, something that reached into the quiet ache of his soul. At first, their meetings were chaperoned, innocent, small conversations, shy smiles, the thrill of stolen glances. But behind those moments was a current neither of them could deny. Priscilla became his anchor in a world that felt foreign. He poured out his loneliness to her, and she listened. She offered comfort when grief overwhelmed him. She wasn't dazzled by the fame or the legend. She saw Elvis the man. For Priscilla, being noticed by him was like being pulled into a dream. She was just a teenager, but suddenly she was the confidant of the most famous man alive. And while she didn't fully understand what that meant, she felt the weight of it. He would call, he would write, and when they were together, the rest of the world disappeared. Still, nothing about their connection was simple. Elvis was in his 20s, already carrying the burden of stardom. She was barely beginning her life. Whispers spread. Was it love? Was it something darker? Friends warned him, her parents worried, but the bond only grew stronger. When Elvis returned to the United States, their lives should have gone in separate directions, but he couldn't let her go. 2 years later, he arranged for Priscilla to visit him in Memphis. She was older now, still innocent, but already molded by the gravitational pull of his world. and once she stepped into Graceland, her life was never the same again. The fairy tale image the public adored, Elvis and Priscilla walking side by side, the perfect Southern romance, hid a reality much more complicated. Their love was both intoxicating and suffocating. Elvis was gone for long stretches, consumed by touring, Hollywood films, and the endless demands of fame. Priscilla remained in Memphis, waiting, shaping her entire identity around a man who belonged as much to the world as he did to her. Elvis, for all his devotion, was restless. He was tender and protective one moment, distant and unreachable the next. Fame had carved out a void in him that no one could fully fill. Priscilla tried. She gave him loyalty, patience, and forgiveness. But in the quiet hours of Graceland, the cracks in their fairy tale began to widen. And yet, for all the turmoil, their love was undeniable. When they finally married in 1967, the wedding looked like the perfect ending to a long romantic saga. The photographs splashed across magazines, the king and his bride, radiant and beaming. Fans cheered. The world believed in the story. But behind the flashbulbs, even that day carried tension. Elvis's friends whispered that he was nervous, distracted, maybe even uncertain. Priscilla herself admitted years later that she felt more like she was fulfilling an expectation than living her dream. The love was real, yes, but so was the weight of the spotlight, the pressure to live up to the image of perfection the world demanded. Their daughter Lisa Marie was born a year later, and for a brief moment, it seemed like they had found their rhythm. Elvis was doting, tender, holding his baby girl with the same reverence he had once reserved for music. Priscilla believed, or at least hoped, that this was the new beginning they both needed. But the cracks never closed. Elvis's career surged, and with it came late nights, temptations, and the loneliness that fame never stopped feeding. Priscilla, young and isolated, felt the walls of Graceland closing in. She loved him, but she also longed for freedom, for an identity that wasn't defined solely by being his wife. By the early 70s, their marriage was unraveling in ways neither could fully stop. And yet, even in the midst of heartbreak, the bond between them never truly disappeared. It became something else, complicated, painful, but impossible to erase. So when Elvis stood on that stage in Las Vegas and whispered, "This one's for Priscilla," it wasn't just nostalgia. It wasn't just a dramatic gesture. It was years of love, loss, betrayal, forgiveness, and longing compressed into 3 fragile words. The audience couldn't have known the depth of it, but they felt it. They felt the tremor in his voice, the weight behind the dedication. They saw a man who had lived larger than life, suddenly stripped down to something heartbreakingly human. And that's why the room went silent. Because in that silence, everyone understood, even if they couldn't explain it, that they were witnessing something more than music. They were witnessing a man torn between the legend he had become and the love he could never fully hold on to. And that was only the beginning. When people talk about Elvis and Priscilla, they often paint the picture of a sweeping romance, the kind of story you'd find in old Hollywood films. A soldier meets a young girl overseas, falls in love, and carries her across the ocean into a world of glamour and destiny. On the surface, it looked like a fairy tale. But behind the photographs, behind the carefully staged smiles, what unfolded between Elvis and Priscilla was never one straight story. It was fragments, moments of tenderness, moments of distance, moments of both devotion and despair. And it was in those fragments that the truth of their relationship lived. Let's go back to where it really began. In Germany, 1959, Elvis was grieving the loss of his mother. He was 24 at the peak of fame, but emotionally, he was a young man who still felt like a boy without his anchor. Then came Priscilla. She was just 14, but she carried herself with a maturity beyond her years. She wasn't loud or overbearing. She wasn't a fan chasing after him. She was quiet, observant. And in that quietness, Elvis found something he didn't realize he needed, someone who made him feel normal again. For him, Priscilla wasn't about headlines or image. She was a reminder of innocence in a world that had already begun to devour him. For her, Elvis wasn't just a man, he was the living dream, the untouchable idol who, impossibly, reached down and chose her. But even then, people questioned it. How could such an age gap possibly lead to something real? Was it love, or was it infatuation? Was it destiny, or a dangerous imbalance? This is where the believer versus skeptic dynamic always haunted their story. The believer would say, Priscilla was the one true love of his life. He chose her above everyone else, he confided in her, and she gave him the loyalty no one else could. But the skeptic would push back. She was too young, too sheltered. Elvis wasn't looking for a partner, he was looking for someone he could mold, someone who would fit into his world without threatening it. Both sides carry truth, and that's why their relationship was never black and white. It was layered, complicated, fragmented. When Elvis returned to America, the story should have ended. A teenage girl in Germany and a world-famous singer back home, it was too far, too impossible. But Elvis couldn't let her go. He wrote, he called, he begged her parents to allow her visits. Slowly, carefully, he pulled her into his orbit. By the time Priscilla arrived in Memphis years later, she was no longer just a girl from the base in Wiesbaden. She was now the young woman Elvis wanted by his side at Graceland. The decision wasn't hers alone. Her parents reluctantly allowed it, believing she would be safe under the Presley roof. But safe didn't mean simple. Life at Graceland wasn't just love and laughter. It was long nights waiting for him to come home. It was watching him leave for movies, tour, and endless obligations. It was learning how to live in a house where every corner whispered his fame. For Priscilla, love meant sacrifice. For Elvis, love meant control mixed with longing. There were nights when he was the tender, soft-spoken man who kissed her forehead and told her she was his everything. And then there were nights when he disappeared into the chaos of his career, unreachable, untouchable. This was the rhythm of their life, fragments of deep connection followed by stretches of loneliness. But still, Elvis saw her as his constant, the woman who waited, the one he could always return to. And in 1967, after years of whispers, pressure, and waiting, he finally married her. The wedding looked like a dream, Las Vegas, cameras flashing, the king and his bride smiling for the world. But if you look closely at the photographs, you'll notice something beneath the glamour. Elvis's smile seems practiced, almost weary. Priscilla's expression carries both joy and nervousness, like someone who understands she's stepping into something bigger than she can control. Because the truth is, even on that day, their marriage wasn't built on steady ground. It was built on devotion and expectation, but also on silence and compromise. They had their moments of real happiness. When Lisa Marie was born in 1968, Elvis cradled her with tears in his eyes. For a time, being a father softened him, grounded him, reminded him of what mattered most. Priscilla felt closer to him than ever in those early months. They were a family. It felt complete. But love doesn't thrive on fragments alone. By the early 1970s, the cracks in their marriage deepened. Elvis's career roared back to life with his Las Vegas residencies. The jumpsuits, the sold-out shows, the screaming fans, he was bigger than ever. But with that came long nights, pills to keep him awake, pills to help him sleep, and a gnawing emptiness he could never quite satisfy. Priscilla, meanwhile, was still young, still searching for herself. She had grown up entirely under his shadow, molded by his world. Now she wanted to step into her own. She began to explore independence, karate lessons, new friends, even small rebellions against the control Elvis tried to maintain. The believer would argue, despite the distance, Elvis always loved her. He sang love songs with her in mind. She was the muse behind the tenderness in his voice. But the skeptic would counter, if he truly loved her, why did he drift into the arms of other women? Why did she feel so lonely inside a house filled with people? Again, both sides tell a piece of the truth, because Elvis did love her, but he also struggled to love anyone fully while trying to carry the unbearable weight of his fame. By 1972, the inevitable happened. They separated. It wasn't one explosive fight, not one scandalous revelation. It was years of distance finally catching up. They held a press conference after their divorce in 1973, walking out hand in hand, smiling at the cameras, trying to convince the world that this was still a story of friendship and respect. but the pain was written in their eyes. For Elvis, losing Priscilla was like losing the last piece of normal he had. For Priscilla, leaving Elvis was the only way she could find herself. But here's the paradox that makes their story so haunting. Even after they ended their marriage, neither of them fully let go. Elvis still called her, still leaned on her. He still looked at her with that same mixture of longing and regret. And Priscilla, even as she built her own life, never stopped caring. She would always be connected to him, not just as the mother of his child, but as the woman who had lived inside his most private truths. That's why the dedication years later hit so hard, because it wasn't just a man singing to an ex-wife. It was the king of rock and roll opening a wound in front of the world. The audience didn't know every detail, but they felt it. They felt the fragments, the young soldier in Germany, the teenage girl swept into a whirlwind, the Graceland bride, the lonely wife, the divorced couple who still couldn't quite sever their bond. When Elvis whispered, "This one's for Priscilla," he wasn't just recalling the past. He was gathering up every fragment of their love story, the joy, the pain, the devotion, the betrayal, and compressing it into a single fragile moment. And that's why the room went silent. Because in that silence, people weren't just watching Elvis Presley, the legend. They were witnessing Elvis Presley, the man, confessing with trembling honesty that love, no matter how broken, never really disappears. When the divorce papers were signed in 1973, it should have been the end. Elvis and Priscilla walked out of that courthouse in Santa Monica, their hands briefly intertwined for the photographers, their smiles rehearsed, their statements rehearsed. They wanted the world to believe it was amicable, even friendly, that they would remain partners in raising their daughter, that no bitterness lingered. But the truth, as always, was far more complicated. Elvis drove away from that courthouse with a hollow feeling in his chest. He was still the king of rock and roll, still adored by millions, still selling out shows. But the quiet truth that settled in the back of his mind was unbearable. He had lost the one person who truly knew him behind the glitter. For Priscilla, walking away was not freedom without cost. Yes, she had her independence now. Yes, she could explore her own identity, no longer trapped by the suffocating walls of Graceland. But she also carried a grief that was sharp and inescapable. She had loved him, and still did, but love alone had not been enough to survive the weight of his fame, his lifestyle, his addictions, and his walls of silence. This was the silent battle they both fought in the years after their marriage ended. The battle between moving on and never truly letting go. Elvis threw himself deeper into his career. Night after night in Las Vegas, he put on the white jumpsuit, stepped under the blinding lights, and gave his audience everything he had left. To fans, he looked larger than life, but those close to him saw what others couldn't: the strain in his eyes, the exhaustion in his movements, the melancholy that clung to him after the curtain fell. And then there were the songs. Every time he sang, "You Were Always on My Mind," or "I Can't Stop Loving You," fans cheered, swayed, and sang along. But for those who knew the story, it felt like something more. It felt like confession, as if Elvis wasn't singing to a faceless crowd, but to one woman who would always haunt him. The believer would say those songs were his messages to Priscilla. He still loved her. He still needed her. His music became the only safe place where he could tell her what he couldn't say aloud. The skeptic would argue they were just songs, part of the act. Elvis knew the audience wanted heartbreak ballads, and he gave them what they wanted. The connection to Priscilla was imagined, not intentional. But then you remember the way his voice cracked, the way he sometimes closed his eyes mid-performance, as if seeing someone who wasn't there, the way he'd linger on a lyric, as though it was a plea. And suddenly, the believer's voice feels hard to dismiss. Because if you strip away the myth, Elvis was still a man who had lost the woman he once built his dreams around, and music became the only language left between them. Meanwhile, Priscilla was rebuilding herself. She had been a wife, a mother, a figure in Elvis's story. Now she wanted to be her own person. She studied karate, explored acting, entered new relationships. On the surface, she was moving forward. But no matter how far she tried to step, she could never fully step away. Elvis was inescapable in the magazines, on the radio, on the billboards. He was also still calling, still pulling her back in subtle ways. There are stories of Elvis phoning her late at night, his voice low, asking about her day, about Lisa Marie, about anything just to keep her on the line. He would ramble, sometimes joking, sometimes tender, sometimes bitter. And when the calls ended, the silence always returned. For Priscilla, these conversations were a reminder that even divorced, their lives were still tangled. She could never hate him, she could never erase him. He was the father of her child, the man she had grown up with, the man who had shaped her entire youth. But he was also the man who had broken her heart, again and again, in ways she could never forget. It was a paradox she carried quietly, the freedom she had fought for and the tether she could never cut. Fans saw fragments of this paradox too. Whenever Elvis and Priscilla were spotted together at Lisa Marie's school events, birthdays or holidays, the cameras clicked furiously. They looked to the outside world like two people who still belonged together. The warmth in their smiles, the ease of their body language, the way Elvis's eyes often softened when he looked at her, it all fed the belief that perhaps, just perhaps, the love had never ended. But behind closed doors, it was more complicated. There were arguments, accusations, tears, and there were also quiet moments of laughter, shared memories, a tenderness that refused to die completely. They weren't husband and wife anymore, but they weren't strangers either. They existed in a space that only the two of them could understand, a space built on history, on scars, and on a love that was battered but not extinguished. On stage, Elvis found his outlet. There's a story from one of his shows in the mid-70s. He was performing "I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry." His voice was raw, his eyes glassy. When the song ended, he didn't bow or crack a joke. He just stood there, silent, staring into the crowd with a look that said more than words ever could. Fans clapped, unsure if they were applauding the performance or trying to break the heavy mood. And then, almost to himself, Elvis muttered, "That's how it feels, you know." Moments like that gave his shows an undercurrent of heartbreak that no pyrotechnics or sequins could cover. It was as if, beneath the spectacle, there was always a man trying to reach one specific person with words wrapped in melody. And the audience felt it. Even if they didn't know the details, they felt the honesty. The believer would argue, this was Elvis bleeding out his love and his loss for Priscilla in plain sight. Every ballad was a letter she never received. The skeptic would counter, he was simply performing. The heartbreak was universal. Fans heard themselves in those songs, not his private life. But when you consider what happened that night he dedicated "Love Me Tender," it's hard not to see those years of music as breadcrumbs leading to that moment. Elvis lived in contradictions. On one hand, he surrounded himself with the Memphis Mafia, with crowds, with noise, with excess. On the other hand, he craved intimacy, loyalty, and a love that could steady him. He still trusted Priscilla in ways he trusted no one else. She was the one who could tell him the truth without fear. She was the one who had seen him broken and still held his hand. He might have let other women in and out of his life, but none ever truly replaced her. For Priscilla, the contradiction was just as sharp. She wanted her freedom, her own path, her own name apart from his. Yet whenever he called, whenever she looked at him, she felt the same pull. The memories of Germany, Graceland, Lisa Marie, they were woven into her like threads she could never cut out. And so they lived, year after year, in this limbo, neither together nor apart, both longing, both resisting, both knowing that the love that bound them was also the pain that kept them apart. By the mid-70s, Elvis's health was faltering. The weight of fame, the strain of his lifestyle, and the demons he fought privately were wearing him down. Yet even then, his shows remained moments of magic. And in those shows, fans started noticing something. When he sang "Love Me Tender," his eyes often softened, his tone shifted. It was no longer just a song from his early career. It was a confession, a memory, a fragment of something too personal to explain. Audiences sensed it. They couldn't name it, but they felt it. The way the atmosphere shifted when he sang those lines, "Love me tender, love me sweet, never let me go." It was as if the song wasn't for them anymore. It was for someone else. And then came the night when he made it clear, when he said it out loud, when he whispered into the microphone, "This one's for Priscilla," and the entire room stopped breathing. Because that wasn't just a performance. That was the culmination of years of silent battles, of songs turned into messages, of love and loss that had never truly died. And the silence that followed wasn't just the crowd's reaction. It was Elvis's truth, finally spoken into the air, finally undeniable. The International Hotel in Las Vegas had seen it all. Glittering lights, roaring applause, shows so extravagant they seemed to outshine the stars outside on the Strip. Elvis Presley was its crown jewel, the performer who could fill every seat, every night, with nothing more than a single note. But on one particular evening, the spectacle gave way to something deeper, something unforgettable. It began like any other show. The orchestra tuned, the stagehands hustled, the lights dimmed. Elvis walked out to a thunderous ovation, dressed in one of his iconic jumpsuits, jewels flashing under the spotlights. He smiled, greeted his audience, and launched into his set with the energy of a man determined to give his fans the best of himself. Song after song rolled out, the classics, the ballads, the rockers that made people leap from their seats. The crowd laughed at his jokes, swooned at his hip shakes, clapped in rhythm. But then, midway through the show, something shifted. Elvis turned to the microphone. His voice, usually brimming with playful charm, dropped low. The room stilled, the kind of hush that rolls over a crowd when they sense something out of the ordinary. And then, with a softness that carried weight, he spoke 3 words. "This one's for Priscilla." The audience froze. Some gasped. Others looked around in disbelief. Priscilla. He had said her name, the name the world still associated with him, even years after their divorce. Fans who had followed every tabloid headline, every rumor of heartbreak, suddenly realized they were standing inside a moment far more intimate than any gossip column could capture. And then the opening chords began. "Love Me Tender." The atmosphere transformed instantly. Moments before, the crowd had been loud, electric, almost unruly in their excitement. Now silence fell, heavy, complete, reverent. No cheering, no clapping, just silence. It was as if the entire audience instinctively understood that this wasn't a performance anymore. It was something else. Elvis's voice, tender and trembling, carried through the hall. He didn't sing like a man entertaining fans. He sang like a man confessing to someone who wasn't even there. His eyes lowered, his expression solemn, his delivery stripped of the usual theatrics. The audience leaned in, holding their breath. Some wiped away tears they couldn't explain. They weren't just listening to a song, they were witnessing a love story unfold in real time, one that was broken yet unbroken, distant yet present. And the silence, it was louder than applause. To the casual fan, "Love Me Tender" was just one of Elvis's early hits, a simple ballad that had once made teenage girls faint with adoration. But to those who knew his story, it carried weight. It had been their song, Elvis and Priscilla's, a melody that symbolized the beginning of everything. Back in Germany, before the fame devoured their private lives, Elvis would sing it softly to her in quiet moments, away from the eyes of friends and family. In those lyrics, "Love me tender, love me true, all my dreams fulfilled," lived the promise of a love untouched by the outside world. And now, years later, he was singing it again, not as a promise, but as a memory, not as a declaration, but as an echo. Every note carried fragments of their life. The wide-eyed girl stepping into Graceland, the radiant bride in Las Vegas, the young mother holding Lisa Marie, the woman walking away from a marriage that could not hold. It was all there, woven into the trembling edges of his voice. People in the crowd would later say they had never experienced anything like it. There were no screams, no whistles, none of the usual hysteria that followed Elvis wherever he went. Instead, there were tears. Strangers held hands. Couples pulled each other closer. Even the hardest skeptics sat in stunned silence. Because in that moment, it wasn't just Elvis and Priscilla's story they were hearing. It was theirs. It was the story of first loves lost, of memories that linger long after the goodbye, of unfinished sentences and unhealed wounds. One woman would later recall, "It felt like we were intruding on a private confession. He wasn't singing to us, he was singing to her, and yet somehow it spoke to all of us." As the final verse approached, Elvis's voice cracked slightly, just enough for the audience to feel the weight of his emotion. His hands trembled on the microphone stand. He closed his eyes, as if trying to summon her from memory. "Love me tender, love me long, take me to your heart, for it's there that I belong and we'll never part." The irony cut deep. They had parted, they had divorced, yet here he was, singing words that denied that truth, words that revealed the ache beneath the surface. When the song ended, there was no immediate applause. The room remained silent for a heartbeat longer, as if no one dared to break the spell. And then, softly at first and then swelling, came the sound of clapping, cheering, weeping. But Elvis didn't smile, didn't banter. He simply nodded, whispered, "Thank you," and stepped back as the band carried into the next number. The moment had passed, but its weight lingered like smoke in the air. Fans left that night whispering, speculating, arguing. Was it a message, a plea for reconciliation, an apology, or was it simply a man revisiting the one love he could never truly let go? The believer's voice says, it was Elvis telling the world that Priscilla was still the great love of his life, that despite the divorce, despite the years, his heart was still hers. The skeptic's voice answers, it was theater. Elvis knew the power of drama, the way a single gesture could electrify a crowd. It was a performance, nothing more. But those who were there insist otherwise. They say you can rehearse a smile, you can stage a laugh, but you cannot fake that kind of silence. You cannot fake the tremor in a man's voice when he's singing not to the thousands in front of him, but to the one person he wishes were there. That moment became part of Elvis lore. Fans passed down the story, whispering about the night when the king stopped being a legend and became a man on stage, raw and vulnerable. To this day, people argue about its meaning. Some say it was a desperate attempt to win her back. Others believe it was his farewell, an acknowledgement that he had lost her but would never stop loving her. Priscilla herself would later admit that she was deeply moved by the dedication. She understood the weight of it, understood the message behind it, even if it came too late to change their story. And that is why the silence mattered, because in that silence lived the truth. Love never really ends. It just changes form, sometimes into longing, sometimes into memory, sometimes into a song sung under the blinding lights of Las Vegas to an audience who realized they were watching history unfold. Elvis Presley gave the world countless performances. He shook stadiums, electrified millions, created a sound that still echoes through history. But perhaps his most powerful moment wasn't when he shouted or danced, but when he whispered. "This one's for Priscilla." 3 words that turned a crowded showroom into a cathedral of silence. 3 words that told a story of love and loss more powerfully than any tabloid, any biography, any rumor ever could. Because sometimes the greatest performances aren't about the legend at all. They're about the man behind the legend, reaching out across the distance of years, hoping that somehow she would hear him. And that is why, even decades later, the dedication still lingers, not just in history books, but in the hearts of everyone who has ever loved and lost and wondered what might have been. Elvis left behind countless iconic moments, but none quite like this. A single dedication, a single song, and an entire room of people held captive by silence. What do you think it meant? Was Elvis reaching out for reconciliation, or was it his final goodbye to the woman who defined his heart? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered, subscribe and join us as we uncover the untold moments behind the legend.